Hi, I'm Hannah Ledlow, and today I'm going to be talking about paleoanthropology, which is a subject in the theme of modern biology for Michael Reedy's class, Science and Technology in World History. I'm Hannah Ledlow, and I will be covering the contemporary issue of paradigm shifts in paleoanthropology. Jacob Lunsford will be talking about the historical context of this problem, and Connor Bianchi will be discussing the future of this issue. So the contemporary problem of paradigm shifts in paleoanthropology. Here we go. In the last couple decades, archaeologists and anthropologists have challenged and defended Eurocentric theories surrounding the origin of man. These theories apply to broad fields of topics including, but not limited to, cognition, defining a species, and communication. According to Escher Pastore of Columbia University, these theories have especially large implications for behavioral modernity and what it means to be human. The book Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari is a good example of traditional European theory as he describes Neanderthals as primitive, unintelligent human relatives when we have ample evidence that suggests that this is not the case. Previous research conducted in Europe on the rise of Homo sapiens includes rock art and the development of stone tools as employed assumptions of gender roles, intelligence, and ritualistic behavior. Originally, European theory shaped the origins of humanity as Homo sapiens outcompeting Neanderthals, and is kind of a special European event, and did not include the developments of tools and behaviors all over the world, especially in Africa. So who are the stakeholders at play? Those with the most to lose are European academics. Shifting away from these traditional theories may disprove a substantial amount of their research. In addition, it moves the focus of human evolution from the regional to a global event, and is inclusive of events and data that occurred outside Europe. Prehistoric Africa is a good example of this, as it is categorized into Stone Ages apart from Europeans' Lower, Middle, and Upper Paleolithic, even though these eras happened at the same time. These categories demonstrate the division between scholars and how they examine prehistoric time, as we do not even have a consensus here. So how is the problem connected to culture, politics, religion, etc.? So this problem is most closely connected to culture and religion. Moving away from Eurocentrism challenges long-standing aspects and characteristics of our culture, like gender roles. With famous ideas such as man the hunter, it is easy to assume that males have always been breadwinners. But then we are ascribing our societal norms on beings who lived thousands of years ago. One study where these norms were tested was in April Noel's 2010 study on the sexually selective use of hand axes, which criticized former research for asserting that males were the only ones capable of producing a symmetrical hand axe in order to attract a female. Noel challenged this by asserting that creating hand axes is a learned skill, and females can, of course, do that too. So this problem is not particularly connected to economics, but they may have implications for the development of communities as well as conflict and early trade. So what do we risk? With these shifts, we only lose the ability to rely on data prior to these shifts. As traditional theories are challenged, they can be either refuted or stand against opposing conclusions. Though none of these debates surrounding these challenged theories has reached a definitive conclusion, they have undoubtedly laid hefty skepticism on these traditional theories. The greater risks are social in nature. As previously mentioned, these shifts have implications for our social norms, but also the origins of humanity. These will be primarily discussed in the context of the cognitive revolution, which theorizes about the intellectual development of humans and is best discussed by G.A. Clarke in his 1993 article, The Paradigms of Science and Archaeology, and McBriarty and Brooks' The Revolution That Wasn't. The famous concept of man the hunter, which can be used to discuss gender as well as scavenging, as challenged by Noel. And the debate surrounding Neanderthals and whether or not Homo sapiens outcompeted them or bred with them to produce the successful species we are today, as in G.A. Clarke's 2002 article, Neanderthal Archaeology, Implications for Our Origins. If proven correct, these new theories change how we think of ourselves and our evolution. We would no longer be able to think of ourselves as the high and mighty species we tend to be.
Now, I'll be setting up the historical context of these paradigm shifts that occurred in paleoanthropology. So what I'm going to be doing today is giving you guys some of the history of paleoanthropology, as well as the 3 paradigm shifts that was most important, and how we kind of perceived our history of civilization. So the earliest studies of human evolution occurred during the time of early Greek philosophers such as Anaximenes, which happened around 600 BCE. A lot of these were heavily influenced by mythology, but still kind of wanted to answer the question of where we come from and where we're going. Paleontology, the scientific field at least, was created after finding the Neanderthal skull in the part of Germany right by Dusseldorf and Cologne. Paleoanthropology is a subfield in anthropology that is looking at understanding the biological and cultural evolution of our own species through the sciences studies of fossil records that comprises direct biological evidence of humanity's past. The fields also include a lot of other fields in general. These fields are paleoanthropology, archaeology, stratigraphy, geochronology, taphonomy, anatomy, genetics, and a whole slew of other disciplines that help create the field of paleoanthropology. So the 3 shifts that I want to be focusing on in this presentation is the Neanderthals and how we perceive them, hunter versus gatherer debate, and then the cognitive revolution that we read about in Harari. The first interpretation of the Neanderthals were that they were kind of dumb, brute creatures, super strong, not a lot going on upstairs. But through more paleoanthropology research, we realized that they're a lot similar to us, so much so that most people from European descent have approximately 2 to 4% of their DNA comes from Neanderthals. The other big one is man the hunter versus man the scavenger, which kind of gives some historical interplay, which I'll talk about later in this presentation. But how we perceive ourselves is that we're at the top of the food chain, started our place through modern to the food chain where we're on top and all other animals we kind of control. As we started excavating animal bones, we started seeing where most of our tool marks and percussion marks were on the ends, getting the fat within the bone, which suggests that we weren't the first first organism to get to these remains, but rather the second or even the last, and trying to get as much as we possibly can from these remains. The last one, which I had the biggest thing reading Harari, was a cognitive revolution, how we kind of perceive ourselves as all of a sudden we had this magic moment of, oh no, we can all start to think and imagine orders and all that fun stuff. But really, cognition within the Homo sapien line was this multiple generations, thousands of years of evolutions that kind of created this moment where it wasn't just one moment, but it was just keep on developing from the initial change. So a lot of these had a lot of social, religious, political analyses can go in. Religious doctrines is challenged through Catholicism and most Christianity. Our place in the world was one that God created us, but that had changed to we slowly build up from 6 million years of evolution. Societal views altered. We started seeing ourselves not as the apex predator, but rather just part of this big old food chain that we're starting to understand. And political ideologies changed. Again, we see ourselves at the top of the food chain without a lot of people or a lot of organisms challenging us, but really we were just here through thousands of years of genetic variation. Concluding remarks, there's constant paradigm shifts in this field. It keeps on growing. The growth of anthropology in itself, as well as the field of paleoanthropology, brings in the connection of so many different sciences and so much information that we hope to one day figure out the question of where we came from and where we're going from now, or where we're going in the future.
So in this section, we're going to be taking a look at the future of paleoanthropology as a field. As discussed earlier, paleoanthropology and anthropology as a whole has gone through a few paradigm shifts. Most recently, in the late 50s, we saw the beginning of a field-wide shift away from the more humanistic approach of cultural historians of the past towards one more grounded in scientific theory and empirical data. This was influenced by the search for universal underlying laws, such as Newton's theory of gravity or Darwin's theory of evolution. This was known as the processual movement. In the 80s, we see another shift away from this new archaeology into one focused less on these broad, sweeping generalizations about culture and humanity, to one more focused on the individuality represented within cultures and the varying adaptations employed by said cultures to survive. This was known as the post-processual movement. It emerged primarily as a critique of earlier anthropological theory and looked at culture the individual as a driver of cultural change. One of the biggest examples of this change in paradigm shift would be, as Jacob said earlier, the Neanderthal. Even the species name has changed from Homo neanderthalensis to Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, representing a closer tie to modern humans than the brutish, dumb caveman thought of in popular culture. For instance, if you look at these sets of ornaments, which one would you consider to be more complex? They look pretty much the same. The one on the left is Neanderthal, and the one on the right is considered modern human. This is all allowed by the different perspectives brought in by non-white non-Western Europeans entering the field. For instance, we see a lot of women and minorities offering their viewpoints. An example of the information that they bring to the field includes ethnographic studies showing and challenging the notion that men in hunter-gatherer societies were considered the main providers as they went out to go hunt, bring back meat. We see among various African cultural groups that scavenging and foraging, in fact, brings back a majority of the calories in their diets. This was, of course, as said earlier, brought on by the different perspectives. Some of the critiques of the post-processual movement include a lack of distinct methodology. As I said earlier, it sort of developed more as a challenge to previous archaeological thought, and it can't really say anything definitive, as it takes a view that human culture is too variable to follow one general rule. Around this time, we also see a study of new areas. So instead of just looking at Western Europe, we see an influx of study into Eastern Europe, Asia, Australia, even going back into African studies with sort of a new lens. Going forward, and the history of this ever-changing theoretical anthropological approach seems to be moving towards a synthesis of the two, so trying to find an underlying rule and law while also taking an individualistic approach. Some of the biggest takeaways is that context of theory is important. The bias of the researchers plays a part. As society changes, so too do our understandings of the past. The end? No.